Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Mr. V. Today we're going to follow on from what we were doing yesterday on indirect taxes and move over to looking at subsidies, which in a lot of ways is a similar sort of analysis and similar conclusions, although in reverse, as you'll see. But there are a couple of differences that are just worth highlighting. So you know the score. In order to participate with Coffee with Mr. V, go and grab yourself a coffee or any of your favorite liquid, put it in a mug, a cup, or a glass, and then with me, the synchronized sip, and that's going to be the best part of your day. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. I love coffee. So subsidies. Subsidies are a form of fiscal policy, a form of government expenditure. Remember, we've done fiscal policy already. Go back and look at one of the previous episodes if you don't remember, but we would call this a transfer payment. This is a payment that literally just goes from the government's bank account into someone else's bank account, in this case, the firm's. And we would really do this in order to reduce the costs of production for a firm. But since there is no economic output in return for the money, that's my definition of a transfer payment. So you wouldn't actually include subsidies in the calculation of national income or in GDP. C plus I plus G plus X minus N, but it doesn't actually form part of that G. We don't consider it as part of G because there's no economic output. And remember, GDP is meant to be measuring the value of economic output. Right, that was a slight aside, but I want to get into the diagram now, the subsidies diagram, which I hope you'll see has a lot of similarities with the indirect tax diagram that we did in the episode before this one. So we have our supply and demand. A good that we might want to subsidize might be a merit good, a good that has positive externalities in consumption. So for example, something like healthcare or education, or indeed it might be reading like books or something like that. So let's put a subsidy on it. The subsidy then is an amount of money that is given to the firm with the intention of reducing their costs of production. Costs of production, remember, are shown on the supply curve. So when you reduce costs of production, you shift the supply curve to the right. And that is meant to be a parallel shift, by the way. I realize that my drawings sometimes on these whiteboards are not perfect. So what will this do? Well, the new equilibrium has increased consumption from Q1 to Q2. So the number of sales has increased. And on the y-axis, or rather on the p-axis, there has been downwards pressure on the price. The price has been pulled downwards. And we shouldn't be surprised by that because we created excess supply. Excess supply, remember, has the consequence of pushing down on prices. Fine. So our subsidy both reduces prices and increases the quantity being bought. And as I said, the reason you would use subsidies a lot of the time is to increase production of a particular good or indeed consumption of it. Healthcare, education being two main ones. I think in other times in the course, I've looked at things like alternatives to demerit goods. So for a long time, e-cigarettes were seen as a healthy alternative to tobacco cigarettes, believe it or not. And so actually for a period of time, e-cigarette production was subsidized, along with diesel cars as well, was subsidized in order to get people to consume more of those and less of what was seen as the demerit good. Both of those are examples of government failure in that the government got it wrong. And actually those goods, diesel cars and e-cigarettes, have turned out to have just as many negative externalities, or in the case of diesel cars, even more negative externalities than the market failure they were trying to fix. So let's analyze this diagram a little bit further. What else can we see? Well, we can see that consumer surplus has increased. So consumer surplus, remember, was there, but now it has increased all the way to here. Consumer surplus, remember, is the difference between what consumers were willing and able to pay, which is shown by the demand curve, and the market price that they did pay, which in the case now is P2 rather than P1. So consumers are pretty happy. In terms of producer surplus, that's wrong, isn't it? Producer surplus was all of that triangle there. And now that we've had the subsidy, it has increased. But not just to here, and I'll show you why in a moment. First of all, we need to do some analysis in terms of how much money the government has actually spent on this subsidy. How much money has the firm received in the subsidy is another way of thinking about that. So I'm going to draw exactly the same diagram, supply 1 shifting to the right to supply 2. And this is quite often where students get it wrong, because they do exactly the same thing as what they do on the indirect tax diagram without actually thinking it through. It's similar, but it's not exactly the same. In the indirect tax diagram, what I stressed to you was the importance of drawing up from Q2. Q2, remember, is the new equilibrium. That's how many goods were being taxed, or in this case, it's how many goods are being subsidized. But if you look, Q2 is now on the right of Q1. In the tax diagram, it's the other way around. What we've actually decreased consumption, so it's over there. So I think sometimes students are in the habit of just going to the furthest left value and reading up from there, but that would be the wrong move in terms of the subsidies diagram. Q2 then, that's the number of goods and services being bought now at the new equilibrium. We read up to there, and then we draw up, remember, to the new supply curve. That straight line distance there is the unit subsidy. So if we're subsidizing the production of e-cigarettes, just to give us a visual, okay, that would be like £5 subsidy per, I don't know, pack of 12 e-cigarettes. I've got no idea how much e-cigarettes cost, yeah? But you get the idea. It's exactly the same price or the same subsidy per unit of this good that's being subsidized. So you can see then why, if you times Q2 by the unit subsidy, you would get total government expenditure. If there were 100 e-cigarettes and every unit of those e-cigarettes got a £5 subsidy, you could see that the government spending would be £500. On this diagram, you would read across to 500, Q2, then the straight line distance between the two supply curves at that point, which is £5, and that gives you the rectangle. Again, that rectangle looks very similar to the rectangle you would draw on the indirect tax diagram, but it's not quite the same, or rather the logic is the same, but it ends up being drawn in a slightly different place. To show you what I mean, I'll very quickly draw the indirect tax diagram here in minute detail. There, you can see that, look, Q2 here is to the left of Q1. Q2 here is to the right of Q1. And you should always be focusing on Q2, the second equilibrium, because that tells you how many goods and services are either being taxed or are being subsidized. So they look the same, but they're not quite the same. Then we can do the same analysis as what we did before. We can kind of look where the original price was and look where the new price is. And the difference between the prices, we would call this the consumer incidence. Again, hopefully you can see the differences with the tax diagram. On the tax diagram, the consumer incidence was on the top. That's because here the price was going up, but with the subsidy, the price is coming down. The producer has not passed on all of the subsidy to consumers. Prices didn't go down by the entirety of the subsidy. Look, the straight line distance, this price hasn't gone down from P1 to here. It's only gone down by a portion of that, and we call that portion the consumer incidence. On the other hand, the top portion of that government spending we would call the producer incidence. So this is kind of producer surplus, which is over and above what they would have been receiving anyway. Okay, so the differences between the two diagrams are that P and C have been reversed. In the indirect tax diagram, consumer incidence is at the top and producer incidence is at the bottom. In the subsidies diagram, it's the other way, right? Producer incidence is at the top and consumer incidence is at the bottom. So those are the big kind of differences between the two, and it's really important to get them the right way around. Otherwise, you're just going to assume that the indirect tax diagram and the subsidy diagram are the same, and they aren't. Going back to this then, we were talking about producer surplus, and the orange triangle was the original producer surplus. Now, where is the new producer surplus? The new producer surplus should be all of this here. Okay, now it depends on who you read and in what textbook about whether you should also add the government spending. And what do I feel? I feel that producer surplus is the difference between what consumers were willing and able to pay, what consumers were willing and able to sell at, okay, as bounded by their marginal cost curve, and the price that they received. But since they did receive all the way up to here, kind of P0, I do think we should include the government spending as part of producer surplus as well. So we should add this here, and all of that is producer surplus as well. So producer surplus is not only this, I don't even know what you would call that, kind of triangle with a bit chopped off it, plus the rectangle over there, and you have now producer surplus. So you can see that subsidies are brilliant for producers. They increase producer surplus by quite a bit. You could also do it in terms of revenue, producer revenue. I'll just use a different pen. Producer revenue was P1, Q1. It's now Q2 in brackets P2 plus subsidy, which is all the way up here. Because remember, the government spending, which is going to the firm because it's a transfer payment, is all part of the revenue. So that you can see the revenue has increased here, here, here. The box has been pushed outwards and been enlarged. So producers are really, really happy about this. Consumers are also really happy. Their consumer surplus has gone down. The only economic actor that perhaps isn't very happy is the government. The government is spending lots of money on this particular subsidy. So therefore, it's more likely to be running a budget deficit and therefore accumulating national debt. If we were talking about protectionist measures, as we might be doing in theme 4, development economics, then also you could argue that foreign producers might not be very happy with this because this will undercut their foreign imports. In terms of subsidies, then, the only other thing to sort of look at is how elasticities, a bit like with the indirect tax diagram, we might would affect the subsidy or the impact of the subsidy. So if we go with inelastic demand, okay, first thing to note is that it hasn't really made much of an impact. I've done this the wrong way around, haven't I? See, even teachers can make mistakes too. So the first thing to say that is the sales have not increased by very much. Remember, it's inelastic demand. So pulling down on price is unlikely to have a large impact on sales. The price has been reduced by quite a lot, though. And what's happened to this government spending? Well, the bracket there, you can see that consumers have seen a huge impact on their prices. They can see prices have gone down by an enormous amount, whereas producers really don't get very much more than that what they would have received anyway. And here is our total revenue. You can see actually it hasn't made a huge amount of difference to total revenue either. So one of our conclusions from indirect taxes should have been that the government should be looking to subsidize tax indirect goods, because I'm making a lot of mistakes here. I'm going to scrap that and start again. One of our conclusions from indirect taxes was that in order to receive a lot of tax revenue, the government should look to tax inelastic goods. It might not mean that consumption's reduced very much, but it should mean that government revenue is very large. In this scenario, there's not really going to be a huge effect on anybody if they start subsidizing inelastic goods. On the other hand, if we start to look at more elastic demand curves, and I'll stop making silly errors first thing in the morning. Okay, you can see that with more elastic demand, first of all, prices don't go down by a huge amount, which is different over here, but consumption has increased by a lot. The government spending box is a lot larger because there are so many more goods now that need subsidizing. The consumer burden is relatively small. Prices haven't changed by a huge amount, whereas producers are much happier. They're receiving a much bigger chunk. They're not passing on any, they're passing on very little of that subsidy in terms of lower prices. So in terms of their revenue, where was it before? It was here. You can see that their revenue is a lot larger than it was before. Right. Hopefully I did a decent job there. I realize I made a few errors ongoing this because I haven't actually planned to do the elasticity business. But nevertheless, hopefully you've got a good idea of what's happening to revenue, or not revenue, government spending as a result of the different elasticities on the demand curve. Okay, perhaps watch this back again and pay attention to the times in which I don't make a mistake, as opposed to the times at the beginning where I was making a mistake. Or just try it for yourselves, okay? Ask me questions, okay, and I'll try and get back to you. Finally then, I thought I would just go back to the indirect tax stuff that we were doing yesterday and just also talk you through the consumer and producer surplus elements, because I didn't do that with you yesterday. So here is our market for cigarettes at P1 Q1, and this time we're going to put an indirect tax on. I'm going to do a unit tax, so a specific tax, and one that doesn't change. Different to the subsidies, we move the supply curve to the left. Okay, that gives us P2 Q2. Price has gone up, sales have gone. Price has gone up, sales have come down. What's happened to consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus was there, okay, where P1 was, and now it has fallen, so it's only there. So we have lost, that's loss of consumer surplus. So consumer surplus has fallen. In terms of producer surplus, it was that area there, and now it is that area there. So they have lost this bit but gained that bit, but overall it's a loss for producers as well. Where's the tax, the government tax? We read up from Q2 to the new supply curve, downwards to the old supply curve, and it's that tax box there. So now you have indirect tax diagrams and subsidy diagrams. You both have the analysis of consumer surplus and producer surplus. You also have a good understanding of how to identify tax revenue or government spending boxes. And within that, you can also analyze where the consumer incidence of that government spending / tax is and where the producer incidence is. And I would recommend that you kind of practice these diagrams a lot, always making sure that you're reading up from Q2, because that's where the most common error always comes from. Students reading up from Q1 and not Q2. The straight line distance between the two supply curves at Q2, there's your box. Look where the original price was and kind of halve it, or it might not be exactly half, but slash across it. And there are your two indices. Have a think to yourself, what does that actually mean? Don't just take it as a phrase without ever thinking to yourself, what does that actually mean? And practice, particularly with different elasticities of both the demand curve, like I've done here, but also have a look at the supply curve as well. Hopefully that does make sense. Hopefully you can watch this a few times and practice these diagrams. If you have any questions, please comment. or please just send me some emails and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you very much. See you next time.